I think the easiest way to understand the service container is not to tell you what it is, but rather to show you where it's located, how you can access it, and some of the things it can do. And then from there, you can use your own simple words to define it. How does that sound? Great, let's get started. Here I have a fresh Laravel application, and instead of returning a view, I'm going to dump the app helper function. When I refresh the page, we get an application object, which is an instance of the application class in Illuminate Foundation namespace. Let's go to that class. If you go to vendor, Laravel, framework, source, Illuminate, foundation, we have the application class, and it's extending the container. Let's go to the container. And this class is our service container. And since the application is extending the container, it means that we can be able to access the container via the application. Let's prove that. So I'll go to the container, and here we have a property called bindings, which is an array. And since it's protected, it means we cannot be able to access it from outside the class. We need a method that is public. And when you scroll down, you'll see that we have this getBindings method that is returning the bindings. So let's try and use this method from the app helper function. I'll go back to web, and then here I'll call that method. Back to the browser, then I'll refresh, and here we get the bindings array. So it's working. Now we know where to locate the container, and we know how to access it. The next thing that we're going to talk about is how does the container work? What does it do? And one of the things that it does is that it allows us to add services into the container. And by services, it's usually classes, but it can be any data that you want. So let's create a very simple service and add it to the container to see how this works. So I'll go to the editor again. Then here in app, I'm going to create a folder called services. And then I'm going to create a simple service called calculator. Calculator.php. And I'm going to create a very simple service. So it's just a calculator class. It has an add method that takes two numbers, and then it just returns the sum of those two numbers. And that's it. So our service, it's a service that is used to calculate the sum of two numbers. Simple. Now let's add it into the service container. I'll go back to web, then use the app function to access the container. And when you go to the container, there is a method called bind. And that's the method we use to add a service into the container. You can refer to it as adding a service or storing a service. Any can do. So this bind method expects two arguments. And the first one is the key that you want to use for your service. It can be any string that you want, but the best practice is to use the fully qualified class name. So in our case, to get the fully qualified class name, we'll just say calculator, then class. And that will give us the fully qualified class name. The second argument is a function. And in this function, we are supposed to return an instance of the service that we are adding into the container. So I'll just say return new, and that is a calculator. And that's it. That's how you add a service into the container. Let's confirm that. And before you confirm, let's switch back to the browser. I didn't mention this. When you add something into the container, it gets added in the bindings array. So now that we've added something, it should be added in this array. And since we have 50, when we refresh, it should be 51, and it is 51. And when you scroll to the bottom of the list, you'll see that our calculator service is added. Now that we've added a service into the container, another thing that the container allows us to do is that we can retrieve the service in our application and use it. So let's do that. Back here, we want to retrieve that service and use it. So instead of die and dumping the method, what you're going to do is that we're going to retrieve a service. How do we do so? If you go to the container, there is another method called make. And that make expects one argument, and that is the key that you've used in the container. And in our case, this was our key. So I'll grab that and I'll just paste it here. And by just doing that, the container will resolve or will retrieve that service from the container. And now from here, we can use our service. We can just say add, then let's just add 1 + 1. And let's see if this works. So if I switch back and refresh and it works, we have 2. Now, there is something interesting that we are about to see. Check this out. If I come here and I comment this out, and then I save, which means now we are not binding anything into the service container. And if you want, you can confirm. You can die and dump the get bindings method, and you'll see that the services are 50 and the calculator service is not being added. But if we do so and go back to the browser and refresh, whoa, it still works. What is happening? So this is exactly what is happening. The service container will first check, does the key with this fully qualified class name exist in the container? And of course, it doesn't. So if it doesn't, it will check the path, app services calculator. Is that a class that I can instantiate? And if that is positive, the service container will automatically resolve or retrieve that service for us. And that's why this is working. Now you might be wondering, if the service container can automatically resolve services from the container for us, then why do we need to bind a service into the container? Good question. And the answer is because there are some instances where the service container will not be able to do that for us automatically. And I'll show you that. So I'll go to the calculator class, and here I'm going to create a constructor. So public function. And I am going to pass a string. I'm going to say string and say this is a string, and I'll call it name. Now, if I refresh, let's see if that works. If I come back here and refresh, no, it doesn't. Binding resolution exception. So the service container was not able to automatically resolve it for us. Therefore, something that I want you to note is that if you have a constructor in the class and the constructor has something that is not a concrete class, and by a concrete class, I mean a class that can be directly instantiated. If it is not a concrete class, the service container will not be able to automatically resolve it for you. So in that case, you need to bind it into the service container. So if I come back here and bind this, then have the name here, just say the name is me, and pass it here. Then go back to the browser and refresh, and that works. I'll switch back, then I'll redo this to what it was, go back to the calculator. So we said that if this is not a concrete class, it will not work. But then we said if it's a concrete class, it will work. So let's see. Let's try a concrete class and see if it will work. So I'll use the user model. So this is a concrete class because you can create an instance of a user model. Then save. So note that now we are not binding it into the container, but we are using a concrete class. So if I switch back to the browser and refresh, it works. And by the way, this is what we call dependency injection. And dependency injection is just a fancy phrase that means injecting a class into another class via constructor. So we are injecting a user class into the calculator class via the constructor. And this is made possible because of the service container. And this is something that you'll often use in Laravel, and it's possible because of the service container. Now, the service container also allows us to do something cool. Instead of doing this, we can type hint the service. So I can just come here and say calculator, and then just use it. Die and dump calculator, use the method which is add. Then let's add 1 plus 1. We need a semicolon at the end. Then back to the browser, refresh, and it still works. And if you ask me, this is cleaner and it looks good. So when you type hint this, the service container will still automatically resolve it for us. And this is something another thing that you'll often use in Laravel, and it's made possible because of the service container. And that's it for the service container. If you want to learn more about it, please check out the documentation. And just a side note, whenever we bind something into the container, we don't do it in the routes file. We do it in something called the service provider, and that's what we are going to cover in the next lesson. See you there. Cheers. This is where we reached in the previous lesson, binding a service via the routes file. But in practice, we do this in the service provider. And by default, Laravel provides us with the provider that we can use. So if you go to providers, you go to app service provider, it's in the register method that you write the logic to bind a service. Therefore, I can grab this, paste it here, and then import the calculator. And since we are explicitly binding a service into the container, we need to explicitly provide the arguments that are required by the service. Therefore, I'll come here and I'll create a user, then create a new instance of it, and pass it here. Now when you refresh the page, everything works as before. And basically that's it. That's what a service provider is. It's a place where you can bind services into the container. A side note, here we are using the app helper function. In the service provider, we also have access to the app property, which you can use instead of the app helper function. They all do the same thing. So I can just come here and say this app, and then save that. We need to have an arrow here. And when you refresh the page, everything works as before. Now, this is cool, but in large applications, you might want to create your own service provider. And that is possible. You can use the artisan command, and that is make provider artisan command. And the name can be anything that you want, but the convention is to use the name of the service, which is calculator. Then you suffix it with service provider. And if you do that, a service provider will be created for you. I'll copy this. Then go to the service provider created, which is here. Go to the register method and paste that and save. Then import calculator. Import the user. Refresh the page, and everything works as before. Now, all along we've been using this bind method. And before we discuss it in depth, let's promote this argument so that this class can have a state. The bind method, it is used to bind a service into the container. It also ensures that every time we resolve a service, it creates a new object. Let me prove that to you. If I come here, comment this out, we are going to resolve the service. So die and dump, that is up, make method to resolve, and then that is calculator class. Then I'm going to resolve it again so that we can resolve it twice to see this. When I refresh the page, you see we have 242 and 247. So every time we resolve it, we create a new object. But in this case, it's ideal because the state of the class is changing. You see here we have user 242, we have user 241. But we have cases where creating the object again when you resolve it, creating all the time, it's not ideal. Let me show you. If I come here and go to the calculator service, then let's change this to a string. That will be a string. Then let's change this to be more descriptive. That is name. Save that. Here we are going to change this. This is no longer a user object, but a string. So array string. Then this has changed to name. And when you refresh the page, we get two different objects, 244, 242, but the state does not change. So in this case, it's not ideal. We are recreating an object, but it's not necessary to recreate it. Again, if depending on how many times you're recreating the object and how expensive it is to recreate it, this can affect the performance of the application. So in this case, it's ideal to create the object once and then just reference it. And to do that is very easy. You just change the method to singleton. Come back, refresh, and you see now we get 245 and 245. So the service container will create it once, and whenever you resolve it again, it will just reference the object that was initially created instead of creating another one. And by the way, this is what is called the singleton pattern, which is a design pattern that ensures a class has only one instance in an application. Last but not least, let's talk about this boot method. And this is this method gets executed when all the register methods in all providers have been executed. Therefore, it means in this boot method, you have access to all the services. So if you need to write a code that depends on other services to be available, this is the ideal place to do that. For example, let's say we want to use the file service. So we can come here and say app, this app. Then let's resolve. So for the file service, let's see the key that is used in the container. So if you come here and scroll down to vendor, Laravel framework, then source illuminate, here we have the components that come with Laravel. So if you're working with mail, the logic for the service will be here. If you're working with the notifications, now we want to work with log. Let's go to the log service provider. And the key being used here is log. So let's resolve that. Come back here, resolve log. Now we'll have that service. And if you check that service, it has a method called info. And here we can pass a string. For now, let's just say log success. Save that. Then let's go to the log file. It's empty. Let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh, go back. And here we can see that the text has been logged here. And that's it for the service providers. If you want to learn more about it, please check out the documentation. And I'll also leave a link in the description. See you in the next lesson where we will learn about the Laravel facades. Cheers. This is where we reached in the previous lesson. And before we start, I'd like to make some changes. I'll remove this. I'll also remove all this. And then I'll die and dump our app helper function. Then resolve our simple class, our simple service rather, which is calculator. Then call the add method from it. And I'm just going to add 1 + 1. Terminate this. Let's confirm that that is working. Refresh, and yes, it is. Now, what we are doing here is that we are retrieving a service from the container, and then we are calling the add method from it. A facade does the same thing. but its syntax is expressive, and we don't call the method dynamically. We call it statically. Let's create a very simple facade to see how that works. I'm going to comment this out and this one because now we want to create a facade that will achieve the same thing. Then come here. Here we're going to create a folder called Facades. And I'll call my facade calculator. You can call it anything you want. Let's create a PHP file. Give it a namespace of app facades. Let's create the class. I'll call it calculator. For a class to be a facade, you need to extend the facade class. Let's do that. Extends a facade class. And then here we just need to override the get facade accessor method. So protected. It's a static function. Get facade accessor. And here we need to return the key of the service that we want to retrieve. And in our case, we want to retrieve the calculator class, calculator service rather. And the key is this fully qualified class name. So let's return that. Return calculator. And that is the one in app services namespace. And since our class is called calculator here, to avoid conflict, VS Code has created an alias for me called services calculator class. And that's it. Now we have our facade. Let's see how to use it. Come back here. I will die and dump the calculator facade. So make sure you import the one in app facades namespace. Then we will call the method statically. So add 1. Let's do something different. 1 plus 2. That should be 3. Let's refresh. And we have 3. So it's working. And I don't know about you, but for me, this is expressive compared to what we have here. Let me remove this. We don't need this anymore. Now we are using facade. And this one. Yeah, this looks cleaner to me. Last but not least, Laravel ships with many facades, which provide access to almost all of Laravel's features. Let's see where they are located. If I go to my files, then go to vendor, Laravel, framework, source, eliminate, then go to support, then facades. Here are all the facades that come with Laravel. Let's review one of the built-in facades, and I'm going to review the route facade. As you can see here, it is facades, then route. And I'd like to review this because you'll always use this one. So when we click here, command click on it, let's go to that class. We can see that the key that is being returned is the router. So this is the key that is used to retrieve the service from the container. That means we can come here, I can copy this, then down here, instead of using the facade, I can just manually retrieve that service. I can say app, then make, and the key is router as you have seen, and then call the get method. Let's comment this out. It means this should work. If I go back there and refresh, it still works. And again, for me, the first one is expressive compared to the second one. So let's stick with the first one. And as you can see, the facade allows us to call methods as if they are static methods, though they are not statics. And that's it for this lesson. To learn more about facades, please check out the documentation. I'll leave a link in the description. And see you in the next lesson, and which is the final lesson where we will learn about the request lifecycle. Cheers. Here I have a route that returns a string. And when we visit this URL, we make a request to the server, and this response is returned. Request lifecycle is the series of steps that Laravel takes to handle a request and return a response. Let's see that in detail. When you make a request to this URL, your web server configuration directs that request to this index.php file. Here we check if we are in maintenance mode, and if that is positive, we load the appropriate view. After that, we register the compose autoloader, and then we load this file. And what this does is that it creates an application instance. Let's see that in detail. We will switch to app.php file. And here we can see the application class, which we covered in the Laravel service container lesson. And with this class, we just configure the base path, then the routing, and then here you can add your global middlewares, and here you can add the exceptions. And finally, we call the create method. And what this does is that it returns an instance of this application class. After returning that instance, we call the handle request method on that object, and we pass the requests. Let's go to that handle request and see what happens. So to the application, handle request, then the first thing we do is that we resolve using the make method the HTTP kernel from the service container. After that, we call this. We call the handle method on that object and we give it the request. Let's see what happens after doing that. So here I'll just then dump. Back to the browser. And we see that that gives us a request object. But this is not what we want to send to the user. We want to send the content. And to do that, we can use the send method on that object. So here, if I call the send method, come back and refresh, we get the same thing. So let's see what happens when we call this handle method to get that response. So we'll go to the kernel and then check out the handle method. So the kernel and the handle method is here. So the first thing, we register the time that we receive the request, and then here we have a try catch block. So if we have any exceptions, they'll be thrown. And then here we enable the HTTP method parameter override, and then we send the request through the router. Let's go to that method and see what happens there. Here, the first thing we do is that we bind the request object into the service container. And this is it's just an alternative of using the bind method. Remember in the previous lessons, we used the bind method, and then we provided a key, and then the second argument was a function that returns a new instance of the object that we want to bind into the container. Alternatively, you can also use the request object, the instance method, and then pass the key. And instead of passing a function, you can just pass the object that you want to bind into the service container, and so that we can be able now to use the request object in our application, throughout our application. After that, we clear any previously resolved instance of the request facade, and this ensures that any future reference to the request facade will resolve the newly bound request object, since we want to work with the request object that we've received from the user. Then we call this bootstrap method. Let's see what it does. So let's come here. And you can see that it checks if the application has been bootstrapped. And if that is not the case, we bootstrap the application with the bootstrappers that we have in this class. So let's go to this property and see those bootstrappers. I'll search for bootstrappers, and here we are. And here the most important action is loading the service providers. And that is because all major features of Laravel are bootstrapped and configured in the service providers. Okay, so after that, let's go back to that through router. Send. What was the method? Send. Through router. Send request, sorry. Send request. Okay, so we are here. After loading those classes, the next thing is that we create a pipeline object and give it our object. Then we call the send method, passing the request. Then we call the through method, which checks if the middleware should be skipped. And if that is positive, then there will be no middleware applied to that request. But if that is not the case, the application's middleware stack will be applied to that request. Then after that, we dispatch that request to the router. Let's see what happens in this function. And in this function, we see that it returns a callback. And what happens is that first, we bind the request object into the service container again. And this ensures that if the request has been modified, we'll have the most up-to-date version of the request object. And an example of a case where the request can have been modified is, for example, when we apply the middleware, it's possible that we might add headers to the request. We might modify the request when we are applying the middleware. Then after that, we dispatch the request to the router. And from the router will dispatch that request to the appropriate route. And in our case, it will dispatch it to this route. And after that, the route method will be executed, or if you're using the controllers, the controller method will be executed. And in our case, this is the method that will be executed, and it will return the response. Now, when the response is returned and sent to the client, the last thing that will happen is that we'll call the terminate method that is provided by the kernel, and provide the request and the response as the arguments. So this method can be called, you can call it in your middlewares, and that enables you to do anything that you want. For example, you can log the information of the request and the response. And that's it for this lesson. See you in the next one, where we will build a blog using Tollstack. Cheers.